The University of Maine welcomes you to the 7th installment in its William S. Cohen Lecture Series. Please join in a warm UMaine welcome for University of Maine President Robert Kennedy, U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder, and former Secretary of Defense William Cohen. Please rise and remain standing as cadets from UMaine Army and Navy ROTC present the colors, followed by our national anthem.
Thank you and welcome to this most special occasion at the University of Maine. Thanks to the generosity and support of Bill Cohen, UMaine has been privileged to host this lecture series for over the past 12 years. Cohen Lectures have been, without a doubt, among the most memorable events in recent UMaine history. In fact, I will go so far as to say that they've been significant in Maine history, bringing national leaders to our state to share their valuable, unique perspectives on current events. Just consider the list of those who have stood on this stage, or in one case, the Houck Auditorium stage since 1997, to speak to large and enthusiastic audiences like the one here today. The series started with a lecture by Bill Cohen himself, setting the stage for what was to come. Subsequent Cohen lectures were delivered by Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, retired U.S. Senator and former astronaut John Glenn, former Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, former CBS News correspondent Dan Rather, Washington Post journalist and author Bob Woodward, and today, the Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder. Bill Cohen has done us a great service by making this lecture series possible, and I'd like you to join me in expressing our thanks to the Secretary. Secretary Cohen will introduce Mr. Holder in just a moment, but I would like to say that we are honored to have him here today. Attorney General Holder is a person of uncommon achievement, intellect, and integrity. I extend my personal thanks to you for honoring us with your presence here today, and I look forward to your remarks. As an institution, we are filled with pride when we have the opportunity to host events of this nature. First and foremost, they provide incredible opportunities for our students. Many are here today, including representatives of our pre-law student organization. This is an event those students will remember for years to come. Opportunities like these supplement the traditional educational experience in meaningful ways, and it is important that we strive to provide our students with access to people who have prominent roles in contemporary society. These events allow the University of Maine to serve the greater statewide community in a meaningful way. People have traveled from all over Maine to be with us, and we appreciate that. Universities like ours provide important opportunities of all kinds, and we're proud to fulfill the role here in Maine. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge a number of special guests who are in the audience today. 3 members of Mr. Cohen's family are with us, his nephews Jim Beckwith and Mark Beckwith, and his niece Lisa Cohen. Thank you for joining us. It is a particular pleasure for us to welcome several members of the Maine judiciary, including Chief Justice Lee Softly and 5 Associate Justices of the Supreme Court, along with members of the federal and state judiciary. We're also honored to be joined by a number of public officials from the state, county, and local government today. Welcome and thank you for your service to your fellow citizens. Several leaders of our state educational community are here today as well, and let me acknowledge the University of Maine System Chancellor Richard Patnaud, members of the University of Maine System Board of Trustees, and members of the University of Maine Board of Visitors. Thank you all for being here with us today as well. I have been fortunate to have the opportunity to introduce Bill Cohen publicly several times. As I prepare for these introductions, I'm always struck by one simple, straightforward reality. He is, by any measure, one of the most distinguished public servants in our state's history. His national and international stature are extraordinary and his impact immeasurable. From modest beginnings in Bangor, Bill Cohen rose to the highest ranks in our federal government, starting on the Bangor City Council, continuing through a quarter century in Congress, first in the House, later in the Senate, and then serving as U.S. Secretary of Defense. And now in the private sector, he has exemplified the best of what Maine people are all about. Bill Cohen is honest, diligent, and courageous. When he stood up in the face of intense pressure during the Watergate hearings in the early 70s, many observers were surprised at the courage shown by the young congressman from Maine. But those who knew Bill Cohen were not surprised at all. They knew of his exceptional integrity, and they knew that it would be but the first of many times we would see his true colors during his remarkable career. His generosity to UMaine has been extraordinary. The donation of his papers from his career in Congress led to the creation of UMaine's Cohen Archive in Fogler Library. That archive expanded significantly several years later when he added the donation of papers chronicling his career in the Pentagon. This is a rich storehouse of invaluable information critical to understanding 3 decades of American history, and we're proud to have it at the University of Maine. Bill Cohen's generosity also allowed us to create the William S. Cohen Center for International Policy and Commerce, which serves as a focal point for education, outreach, and research on important and timely international issues. The center's programs and resources benefit historians, students, public servants, business people, and the general public. It is an important part of this university and like the Cohen Archives and the Cohen Lecture Series, we're honored to host it at the University of Maine. As an aside, I want to let you know that I've been suffering a bit from a cold in the past few days, and to avoid being a distraction because of my cough, I'll watch the lecture from offstage and return later to the podium. The University of Maine is proud of its association with Bill Cohen, a favorite son of Maine, particularly this part of our state. We are delighted to welcome him back to Maine, and I ask you to join me in a warm University of Maine welcome for William S. Cohen.
President Kennedy, thank you so much for your kind words, and you may have noticed we didn't shake hands as he left. And we decided we're going to greet each other the Thai way, which has to be a much safer way in view of what's going on in the world today. But thank you for your very kind remarks and for introducing and recognizing so many of the people who are here today. I hate to do this because the moment I start recognizing everybody that I know, we'll never get to the remarks of our distinguished guests. But there are just a couple of people in the audience. We mentioned Mark Beckwith, my nephew, Jay McCluskey, who I've known for years, been on opposite sides on many of the cases over the years, but a great public servant. Ralph Lancaster, Mary Lou, Ralph being one of the truly preeminent lawyers of our state and our country, along with Gerald Rudman, who is here as well. And then, of course, there's F. Lee Bailey, my friend and truly preeminent trial lawyer in the country. Great to see you here, F. Lee. And finally, the Talbot family. Bob Talbot and I graduated together. He much more distinguished than I in terms of giving the valedictory address, and me just kind of the class historian. But Bob, great to see you, and Gerald, you and your family as well. It's a pleasure for me to be back to the University of Maine for the lecture series. We started the lecture series, as President Kennedy has indicated, some years ago, but the purpose was to deepen the public discourse on some of the most pressing issues and global challenges facing our country. And throughout the years, some of the themes have remained fairly constant. On the one hand, we've continued to value democracy and the rule of law, of course. We continue to make strides toward the promotion and the protection of civil rights, the elimination of racism and bigotry, the eradication of poverty and disease throughout the world. And yet the increasing speed with which our world continues to spin over the past decade has brought some fundamental change in the ways in which we communicate, do business, and conduct foreign policy. Integrated economic markets and globalized security threats require decision makers to respond almost instantaneously to ever-shifting paradigms. And more fundamentally, however, is the speed of the world today. It has blurred the line between domestic and international issues, between national and international interests. And as we've seen with the most recent onset of the global recession, the effects of policy decisions made in one country no longer are constrained by national borders. And as we tragically saw 8 years ago on 9/11, one country that lingers in the political and economic backwash of history can inflict carnage on another country half a world away. So the changing nature of the world, and with it the changing nature of the threats facing the United States, has brought to the forefront new challenges and questions about our laws and our legal system. And as we saw just last month in New York City and then again in Denver, the threat of terrorism on U.S. soil remains real, and our nation's law enforcement officials and the legal experts must remain vigilant and ready to confront its evolving nature at any time. But in so doing, our law enforcement professionals have to also protect perhaps the greatest advantage that America possesses in this battle of ideas: our commitment to the rule of law, justice, and equality for all. And this, no doubt, is a monumental task, and I can't think of anyone who's more qualified to lead the effort than U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder. Throughout his career, our honored guest has demonstrated an unflinching commitment to the values that underpin our legal system. He's been a champion of equality and justice for the disadvantaged, a crusader against corruption and the abuse of power at all levels. At no time could such a strong moral grounding prove more critical to our leaders and confronting the challenges of today, a time in which some have labeled the age of future shock, the age of turbulence, and most recently, the age of the unthinkable. Attorney General Holder began his illustrious legal career at Columbia, where he earned a BA in American History in 1973. He graduated from Columbia Law School in '76, and during this time he clerked for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and the Department of Justice Criminal Division. In 1976, he was assigned to the newly formed Public Integrity Section of the Department of Justice, where he was tasked with investigating and prosecuting officials for corruption at the local, state, and federal levels. He later served with distinction as U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, and in 1988 he was nominated by President Reagan to become an Associate Judge of the Superior Court of the District of Columbia. 9 years later, in 1997, he was named to the post of Deputy Attorney General by President Clinton, a post that he held until the year 2001, during which time we established a friendship and worked together on a number of issues, and he has remained a close and dear friend. In January 2009, after several years of successful private practice, he became the first African-American Attorney General in U.S. history. And perhaps Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had Eric Holder in mind when he said that the arc of history bends towards justice. While, this rather impressive set of credentials, I think is so impressive, few of you might understand that he's not the only trailblazer in his family. His brilliant and beautiful wife, Sharon Malone, is a medical doctor who's dedicating her efforts to addressing the issues involving teenage pregnancies. And his late sister-in-law, Vivian Malone Jones, was one of the two students whose determination to register and attend the University of Alabama, even in the face of insults and threats, led to the famous Stand in the Schoolhouse Door. Through her sheer courage and conviction, Vivian pushed open that shameful iron door of segregation. In addition to his impressive set of achievements, some of you might know that during his high school and college days, the Attorney General was an avid basketball player. And I'm told that he brings a kind of New York City rough and tumble, trash-talking game to the court. And even though he is younger and taller, I think he'd meet his match if he were ever bold enough to take on a sharpshooter who once was known as Bangor Billy. Attorney General Holder now occupies the office one held by a personal hero of his, Robert F. Kennedy, not to be confused with the university president. Robert Kennedy is going to be remembered for many things that he did in the pursuit of equal justice for all. But fixed in my mind's eye forever is that terrible moment on April 4th, 1968, when Dr. King was assassinated. Bobby Kennedy stood on a flatbed in Indianapolis, which is the hometown of my wife, Janet, and he announced to a heartbreaking news to the stunned crowd. And he spoke about the loss of his own brother at the hands of an assassin, and how the pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart. And then he concluded his statement that evening with a call to action. And quoting from the Greeks, he said, "Let us dedicate ourselves to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world." Ladies and gentlemen, Eric Holder has dedicated his life to this very cause, and I am proud and honored that he be with us today to help us tame the savageness of mankind and make gentle the life of this world. Eric, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I was just telling the secretary, now known to me and forevermore as Bangor Billy, and I will not let him forget that, that introduction is perhaps the best speech I've heard in the last 20 years or so, and so now he puts me up here after him. Before I begin, I'd like to thank President Kennedy, safely ensconced over there. He's in isolation over here. And Chancellor Patnod for welcoming me to the wonderful university. the Chief Justice, the Justices of the Supreme Court, First Lady Baldacci, thank you for being here as well. I'd like to also recognize the many judges who I've had the chance to meet. My good friend Jay McCluskey was here. Jay, one of the great U.S. attorneys in the history of, I think, our country. I had a chance to work with him when I had dark hair a while ago. And I've got F. Lee Bailey here, a person who I'm going to convince, he doesn't know this, he's going to be an assistant United States attorney by the time I'm done, but a legal legend and a person to whom I've always looked. We also have distinguished representatives from the United States Department of Justice, and I understand the United States Attorney, Paula Silsby, will be here. But I especially want to thank our host and my dear friend. It says Secretary Bill Cohen, but I'll Bangor Billy. And not just because he gave me such a kind introduction. As you all know better than most, Bill has always loved and has always served this state for most of his professional career. Throughout his life, whether as a U.S. Senator, as a Congressman, or as Secretary of Defense, he has demonstrated how America's destiny is intertwined with nations and peoples in every corner of the globe. He has recognized that preserving our ideals at home, be it in Orono, Maine, or Washington, D.C., requires bringing to bear all of our resources, gunboats and diplomats, aid and understanding alike, the power to wage war when necessary, the ability to conduct diplomacy when possible, the generosity to provide aid when needed. Our nation must exercise these options carefully and always consistent with the rule of law. I commend Bill's service to the country in carrying out these ideals and serving as a model for all of us, and certainly as a model for me. And I'm honored to call him and his wife Janet my good friends. I also want to thank Bill for inviting me here today. It's wonderful to be here with you in such a beautiful part of the country. This is my first visit ever to Maine. Given the beauty and the tranquility of this great state, and given the events in Washington, D.C. that I confront every day, Washington seems now about 1 million miles away. I think I might stay here for a while. But what I'd like to speak to you today about is the role of the Justice Department in keeping this country safe and how we attempt to do so on a day-to-day basis. Protecting this nation is my #1 priority as Attorney General. It keeps me awake late at night, and it gets me up early every morning. I've spent most of my career working at the Department of Justice, including during the second term of the Clinton administration, as was indicated as the Deputy Attorney General, the #2 position in the department. I left that job in February 2001 after the inauguration of President Bush and spent the Bush administration working in the private sector. When I returned to the department this past February, I found that it had been transformed by the attacks of September the 11th, 2001. In the intervening years, the department and the Federal Bureau of Investigation had built new capabilities to defend the country from terrorist attacks. These capabilities were focused not just on prosecuting those who do harm to our nation, but also on disrupting plots before they happen. It is our paramount responsibility to do everything that we can to protect our nation from terrorist attacks. We cannot afford to become complacent and to take our security, prosperity, and freedom for granted. But nor can we afford to lose sight of the ideals and the values that have made our nation a shining beacon of freedom since we fought the Revolutionary War. We must continue to stand for the rule of law, even as we fight against those who would do us harm. Even in the throes of battle, we cannot, as our nation has regretfully done in the past, we cannot abandon the rule of law. As Americans, we all bear, I believe, a special responsibility to both uphold and promote the rule of law. This sacred responsibility springs from our unique role, our unique place in history. It is the animating force of our heritage and of our destiny as a nation. The founding documents of our democracy, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States, established for the first time in the world's long history a government not of men, but of laws. to a world governed by kings and emperors, dukes and czars, our founding fathers breathed life into an idea which caused common men to rejoice and despots to tremble. And it is the force and majesty of this idea that created the most powerful nation on earth. As it was at our founding, so it is today. Our strength derives from the sinews of those historic documents and from the enlightened principle of the rule of law that they have so nobly enshrined in our national ethos. For more than 2 centuries, the rule of law has served as the shining torch that has illuminated our path through our nation's darkest days. Now, to be sure, at times its light has flickered and it has waned, but always the flame has brightly flared anew and boldly marked our way home once more. Indeed, the brilliant light of that torch has guided us to the forefront of international movements for human rights, for the lawful treatment of dissidents, and for free and open societies. Our country is at its best when it has provided the beacon light of the rule of law for all the world to see. Now, as Attorney General, I think about these issues every day. Every morning I start the day with a threat briefing that serves as a constant reminder of the ongoing challenges that we face and the persistence of our many enemies. I can assure you that the threat is very, very real. So learning to respond to it in a manner that is both effective and consistent with our values is not an abstract concept. It is a practical reality for me every day. Now, I'd like to make those abstractions as real to all of you today as I possibly can. Our efforts to stop a terrorist attack often start with an intelligence tip. This initial tip can come from any number of sources, including human intelligence contacts developed at home by the Federal Bureau of Investigation or abroad by the Central Intelligence Agency, the Department of Defense, or another partner in the intelligence community. Key information may also come from one of our partners at the state or local level, or even from a concerned citizen who reports activity that he or she perceives to be suspicious. In fact, some of the best and most important tips come from everyday Americans who see something that to them just doesn't look quite right. Now, as you can imagine, an enormous amount of tips and other intelligence information comes across the transom each and every day. The key to handling them properly is to sift through them to separate the wheat from the chaff, to determine what might constitute a serious threat and what does not. When we do identify a threat, there are a number of ways in which we can follow up. We run the information through all of the databases that are kept by our intelligence community. The FBI may begin physical surveillance of a subject or conduct interviews to see if the information requires further action. The FBI may then also issue what are called national security letters, a tool which allows investigators to obtain information on financial or telecommunications transactions. Now, this investigatory work done by the FBI is coordinated by the Justice Department's National Security Division and, as appropriate, with elements of the intelligence community. One of the lessons learned in the wake of 9/11 was that it is crucial to harness the knowledge and resources of the entire government. So the Director of National Intelligence, the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, and the National Security Council at the White House are kept informed and involved as we moved forward. Now, if these initial steps show that further investigation is warranted, we might seek court approval from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act to collect intelligence information by monitoring electronic sources. Now, applications for this kind of coverage are classified. I'm not really publicly able to discuss the specifics. So yes, this is where you can let your imagination turn to Jack Bauer of 24 fame. In reality, however, unlike on TV, all of this activity is approved by lawyers at a very high level. And yet, for some reason, the producers of 24 never seem to include scenes of me signing hundreds of pages of documents. And so it's important to note that intelligence collection is just really one side of the coin. On the other side is the legal support that ensures that our counterterrorism work operates in strict compliance with established laws and established procedures. There is a team of lawyers in the Department of Justice's National Security Division who work daily to review intelligence collection requests and to present them to a special court known as the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. Everything that we do is subject to strict procedures and oversight by the court and by Congress to ensure that our investigations are adequately safeguard individual liberties. Now, in these investigations, we can also bring to bear traditional criminal investigative tools that have been used for years to target criminals ranging from mafia bosses to drug kingpins. For example, our prosecutors in the United States Attorney's offices around the country can use grand juries to obtain documents and to compel testimony. They can offer incentives, such as reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation, which may lead to critical intelligence information and allow us to build a case or to disrupt a terror network piece by piece. Of course, if the threat involves elements overseas, as many plots do, we will work hand in hand with the intelligence community, the Defense Department, and our foreign partners to develop an effective strategy. We have forged powerful bonds with our allies overseas, and we continually draw on their expertise, their tools, and their authorities. Modern terror networks are not bound by national boundaries. Therefore, we can't let those boundaries stand in the way of our efforts to fight them. Above all, we are, I think, pragmatic. We make rational decisions by having officials from every relevant executive branch agency sit down together to evaluate any potential threat and decide which tools that we can best use to disrupt it. Now, there's no room for turf battles when it comes to protecting the American people, and I can assure you that every member of this administration's cabinet is committed to working together to keep the country safe. This effort really requires a tremendous amount of hard work by people who toil in the background without recognition. In the Department of Justice, they are the FBI agents in the field who follow up on the initial leads with surveillance and interviews, the attorneys who coordinate with the investigators and analysts in the intelligence community, the intelligence analysts who sift through the data looking for important patterns, and the lawyers who go before the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. And that is not to in any way mention the many other federal, state, local, tribal, military, and foreign partners with whom the Justice Department coordinates to make sure that at the end of the day, each and every terrorist threat has been neutralized. As President Obama declared at his recent visit to the National Counterterrorism Center in Virginia, and I quote, "When working to disrupt terrorist networks, there is one goal, and we are one team." Of course, each of these steps must abide by the rule of law. This is who we are as a nation. Since the enactment of important reforms in the 1970s, strict legal oversight is how the United States has protected civil liberties in intelligence matters. I believe the steps that have been taken to build on that in the last few years by bringing our lawyers and intelligence investigators together to work on terrorism investigations have increased the effectiveness of the many rule of law mechanisms that have long been in place. Working together, we ensure that civil liberties are protected to the greatest extent possible. Working together, we ensure that our actions are always based on specific information and not on stereotypes or rushed judgments. Working together, we continually evaluate whether we are pursuing the correct path or need to rethink our assumptions. Now, let me be very, very clear. We cannot, we need not, and we will not sacrifice our core values in order to ensure our safety. Adherence to the rule of law strengthens our security by depriving terrorist organizations of their prime recruiting tools and their legitimacy. When we commit to operating within a constitutional framework, we distinguish ourselves from the enemy that we are acting to defeat. We have to lead not only by overwhelming strength, but also by good example. A few seem to have forgotten what to me is this most basic of American values and have lost touch with what I believe truly distinguishes us as a nation. Now, as I mentioned before, most of this work happens far from the public spotlight, as it should. But in the last month or so, we have seen the seriousness of the threats that still exist and an urgent reminder of the importance of our efforts. The alleged plot in Colorado and New York to detonate an explosive device in the United States was one of the most serious threats this nation faced since 9/11. Now, this wasn't merely an aspirational plot with no chance of success. This plot was serious. It was developed, and had it not been disrupted, it could have led to the loss of American lives. I caution that our work continues with regard to this matter. But the good news about this case is that the system worked. A coordinated effort led to the disruption of this plot before any Americans could be harmed. But the system, our system, has to work every time. We cannot lose. We cannot miss even one time. We can't rest for even 1 minute, and we will not. Now, I'd like to encourage the students here today to join us in this effort. I started my career as a line attorney in the public integrity section of the Department of Justice. It was there that I learned from agents and colleagues how to investigate and how to try a case. It was a wonderful job, the first of many that I've held with the department, and the experiences that I forged there have guided me throughout my career. There are countless ways for young, idealistic people to become involved. Perhaps working on counterterrorism issues, such as the ones that I've talked about, might appeal to you. If so, there are opportunities not only in the Justice Department and the FBI, but also in the military and in state and local law enforcement, in the intelligence community, and in other federal agencies. Or perhaps the idea of working on civil rights matters really excites you. If so, I would welcome you at the Justice Department, where we are already, we have an outstanding cadre of great public servants, and where we are hard at work strengthening and transforming and reinvigorating our civil rights division. Or perhaps promoting and defending our civil liberties is what really animates you. If so, there are scores of opportunities in the public and private sectors. Whatever your calling, I hope that many of you will follow a path that leads you, if only for a time, to public service. While this nation presents boundless opportunities, it also faces real challenges in the years ahead. We need your energy, we need your idealism, and we need your thoughtfulness more than ever. So let me end with a final tribute to this great state. Joshua Chamberlain, at the dedication of the 20th Maine Monument at Gettysburg in 1889, spoke these words, and I quote, "We know not of the future and cannot plan for it much, but we can hold our spirits and our bodies so pure and high, we may cherish such thoughts and such ideals, and dream such dreams of lofty purpose, that we can determine and know that what manner of men we will be whenever and wherever the hour strikes that calls to noble action." End quote. Those words are as relevant today as when Chamberlain recited them 120 years ago. Now, while the national security issues that I've discussed are some of the most difficult of my generation and yours, thanks to the hard work of many men and women who have dedicated themselves to safeguarding our nation, I'm really confident that we will be ready whenever and wherever we receive that noble call to action, and be proud of the manner in which we defend the nation that we all love. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Holder, for those insightful, interesting, and important perspectives. You follow on the footsteps of giants in giving Cohen lectures here at the University of Maine, and you've certainly lived up to those high expectations. If I could ask you to join me again at the podium along with Secretary Cohen. We now move to a brief question and answer session. We've been collecting written questions from our audience throughout this morning's program, and we've selected a few to ask you. Ross Woland, a UMaine junior from Presque Isle studying pre-law, will ask the questions. Ross?
And Bangor Billy is going to answer all the difficult ones.
Good afternoon. This question is directed to the Attorney General. In the spring, the Maine legislature passed and the governor signed a law allowing same-sex couples to marry. If this right is upheld in a coming referendum, those Maine couples will have no federal marriage rights. For instance, surviving spouses won't get Social Security benefits. What is being done to repeal the Defense of Marriage Act and a related policy, Don't Ask, Don't Tell?
Well, the President has indicated that we will take the necessary steps to repeal both DOMA and Don't Ask, Don't Tell. He is quite sincere in his desire to do that. It will happen with the help of Congress. Many people have been, I think, a bit flummoxed by what has been the stated intention of the President in the briefs that the Justice Department has filed in support of the Defense of Marriage Act. And maybe if I could just explain why there is that dissonance. The Justice Department has the obligation when there is a statute that can be seen, can be viewed as constitutional. We have an obligation to defend it. And so though I fully support what the President has said, that is the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the repeal of DOMA, I have a responsibility as Attorney General to support a statute passed by Congress. But it is this administration's intention to work as hard as we can and as quickly as we can to make both of those policies relics of the past.
This question is directed towards Secretary Cohen. As you know, Maine is represented in Congress by two Republicans who are often considered moderate. As a former moderate Republican who represented Maine in the U.S. Senate, what do you feel is the future of these moderate Republicans and their party, considering the harsh attacks that come from the right as they maintain their moderate positions?
I think the party has drifted too far to the right, and as a result of that, we're going to be, there'll be a very aggressive, very narrow band of people who represent the party. I think that it's been a mistake not to reach out and embrace those of more moderate views of the Republican Party philosophy. When I am asked, they ask me, are you still a Republican? I say yes, I am a Maine Republican. And before I conclude, there are a couple of people I failed to mention who've had a major impact on my life in public life. Tim and Carol Woodcock, who are here with us today, who has been with me over the years. We have Norm Minsky, that I can't see from here, but who persuaded me to leave Bowdoin College at the end of my senior year and go into law at Boston University. And finally, of course, Grog Johnson, Admiral Johnson, who was with me at the Pentagon and carried out some major missions on behalf of this country, and is now a permanent resident of Maine, as he always has been. Anyway, I hope, does that answer your question? I think that we are becoming too narrow, and I think that as a result of it, we ultimately will suffer. I think most people are in the middle, frankly, that most people want to see their government work, and my philosophy has always been, if a Democrat has a great idea, let's use it. If Republicans have a good one, let's use it. But let's not divide our country along those lines.
The next question is directed at the Attorney General. Many are concerned that there was law-breaking in the Bush administration with respect to its torture and wiretapping. Is there any intention to investigate and, if appropriate, prosecute lawbreakers, no matter how high their position in government?
Well, the applause for the question. The position that we have taken, and I stated as early as my confirmation hearing, is that no one is above the law. There are Office of Legal Counsel opinions that frankly I don't agree with and that have been repealed by this administration, under which many people in our intelligence community operated. It is my belief, it is the President's belief, that it would be inappropriate to prosecute people who acted in good faith and in conformance with those OLC opinions. I have, however, appointed a gentleman, John Durham, to look into the question of whether or not those opinions, which again I don't agree with, whether or not those opinions were exceeded by the conduct of people conducting, among other things, these enhanced interrogation techniques. If we find that people did go beyond those limits, prosecution of people will be considered, and we'll follow the evidence wherever it takes us.
The next question is the next question is directed towards the Attorney General again. Before 9/11, when the word terrorism was used, the image of racist and anti-Semitic extremists came to mind. Today, the term tends to bring to mind radical Islamists from the Middle East. However, 9/11 did not eradicate the racist extremists, it only diverted our attention. How do you balance the obvious focus on foreign terrorism with the lingering radicals who set their sights on abortion clinics and minorities?
No, that's an excellent question. The terrorist threat that we face comes not only from without the country, it comes from within our borders as well. It's one of the main reasons why, after 11 years, I testified on behalf of the bill. When I was Deputy Attorney General, it was passed by the Senate, I guess, yesterday. We have a hate crimes bill that will cover a whole new range of people, categories of Americans, people with disabilities, women, gay, lesbian Americans. And that is a primary tool that we will be able to use in the fight against domestic terrorism. But the premise of the question is exactly right. Our focus is not only on Al-Qaeda and those from outside our borders. We focus as well on those groups and those individuals within our borders who would do harm to the American people in different ways. And as you have seen in the arrests that we have made, I guess in the past 2 months or so, we have arrested a number of people in the United States who either have become radicalized or who espouse, for lack of a better term, the more traditional kinds of hate that has generated terrorist activity. So we have not lost sight of the fact that we have to keep our eye on what happens within our borders as well.
Again, sorry to focus on the Attorney General. You were the chair of the Obama administration's vetting team for the Vice President. Can you explain that process and maybe give us some names, if you're allowed, of people who were considered that maybe didn't make it into the mainstream?
Who gave you that question? Well, no, I'm not really at liberty to discuss other people who we considered. I will say, I'm not sure if I've ever said this publicly, but I will say that at our initial meeting in Chicago, when the President called me, Jim Johnson, and Caroline Kennedy together to say that he wanted us to conduct the search, he had an initial thought. And his initial thought was that Joe Biden would be the person who ultimately we would think would be the person best suited to run with him as Vice President, because that was the determination that, at least where he was, but he made very clear to us, you guys get out there, do your interviews, do your research, talk to various constituencies, and then make a recommendation to me. It came down to 3 finalists, and both Caroline and I wrote separate memos to the President, and both of us agreed that Joe Biden was the person who should have been nominated. And I think that given the performance of the Vice President, he's shown that we were pretty smart.
backup questions. Didn't realize we'd have this much time. How does the current administration's views on the FBI's use of informants within mosques and other areas of worship differ from that of the Bush administration? That's the Attorney General.
All right, here's a little tidbit. We'll get back to that question in a minute. One of the people that we did consider was this gentleman right here. And Secretary Cohen doesn't really know how close he came in the process. He had one problem, though. He was John McCain's best man at his wedding. And as we played that out, we just thought, that's going to be difficult. That's going to be difficult. So that was in response to the previous question. I'm sorry, and this question was,
How does the current administration's views on the FBI's use of informants within mosques and other areas of worship differ from that of the Bush administration?
I'm not sure that if one looks technically at the guidelines that are in place, that they are fundamentally different or different in any way. What the FBI tries to do is the job that we expect them to do, which is to detect terrorism, detect those who would do harm to the nation while fully respecting the religious freedoms that people have, the First Amendment rights that people have. There are FBI guidelines that went into place, I guess, in December of last year that we are still in the process of reviewing. One to let them, by experience, we wanted to look at them over the course of maybe a year or so, and I think early next year we'll look and see whether or not those guidelines need to be revised. We have an FBI director, Bob Mueller, who I have worked with in a number of different ways, who I have great respect for, and I think who has infused the Bureau with the sense that as aggressive as we have to be in this fight against terrorism, we have to do so in the right way. Now, there will be times when somebody will get too close to a line and perhaps even cross a line, but we have tried to do through training and by familiarizing agents in the field with what we expect of them. We try to minimize the number of those kind of instances.
This next question is directed towards Bangor Billy. Secretary Cohen, can you comment on the current situation in Afghanistan and what your views are that should be done?
How much time do we have? Well, as you know, the President is now undergoing a review of the strategy. It's clear to me what has happened. He has appointed, with the recommendation coming to the Secretary of Defense, General McChrystal, and invested in him the respect and admiration for the job he has done previously in terms of being head of a counterterrorist operation and now counterinsurgency. And sometimes the two are conflated and confused. Counterterrorism is when you're hunting down and trying to capture or kill the very people who are trying to harm you. That's counterterrorism, different strategy. Counterinsurgency has to do with winning hearts and minds, protecting people against those who are trying to harm them. And so you don't win hearts and minds by launching Hellfire missiles from unmanned drones into populated areas trying to kill certain individuals. You end up creating many more insurgents and terrorists than you started out with. So you have to separate the two. The issue that now is being reviewed is whether or not we have the right strategy and the right resources. According to General McChrystal, as I understand it, and I have not been privy to the actual report, General McChrystal has indicated on a counterinsurgency strategy, we are in danger of losing that particular effort because we have a mismatch or a disconnect between the resources and the strategy. So the President's got a choice. You can either take the recommendation of General McChrystal and saying, okay, I've got the right strategy, now I've got to make the resources match it, more people. Or looking at the entire area, maybe I should change or modify the strategy to be more consistent with what I can achieve. Before making that decision, which I hope comes fairly soon, but before making that, the president, in my judgment, has to look over his shoulder and say, who's with us? The United States cannot carry out any campaign, be it in Iraq, Afghanistan, or anywhere else in the world, unless you have people with you. We are not a unilateralist power. If we ever were, there's no place you can go. You can carry on a campaign like that alone. So we need allies and supporters. And the president's got to be sure, if we're going to carry out this campaign, which is going to last years, and we shouldn't be under any misapprehension about it, it's going to last years, that we have our allies who are also committed with us, because if they're not with us, then it becomes an American war. And I took issue with the Washington Post article that tried to justify something which I understood what they were doing. My Republican friends were saying this is Obama's war. And the Washington Post came out with a headline saying, no, this is America's war. And they were trying to say it's our country's war, and I thought that was a mistake because it's not ours. It's the world community's war. Everybody has an interest in making sure that the Taliban and al-Qaeda don't dominate both Afghanistan and potentially Pakistan. So let's not make it America's war. Make sure you have allies, that they are committed. They're not going to be committed unless they're sure we have the right strategy. So it all has to come together fairly soon. And I say I hope reflection is important, but I hope reflection doesn't turn into irresoluteness. And so time is kind of the essence in this case, because if you've got young men and women, children, 18 and 19 and 20, who are out there putting their lives on the line, losing lives and limbs, and you don't have enough of them because you have that disconnect, you better fix it fast. And if you've got something you need to change, fix that also in terms of the strategy. So I'm hopeful that the president will come to a conclusion fairly soon. I think it's right to be reflective. I think all that's going on right now, and I just want to take 1 minute to inflict this upon you as well. I find it hard to really digest what's going on politically in our country in terms of the back and forth, where now the former Vice President Cheney is attacking President Obama on these issues, saying that we handed you a great strategy, now you're messing up with it. Well, I go back in terms of what we handed the Bush administration as well, coming out of the Clinton administration, in terms of dealing with Iraq. It didn't quite handle that as well as it might have been handled. So what we have to do, in my judgment, is we've got to stop engaging in this kind of behavior, which I think is almost reminds me of what Patrick Moynihan, Senator Moynihan, said one time. He wrote an article. He said we were defining deviancy down. In other words, behavior that was one time seen to be deviant or certainly below the norm, we were lowering the norm so that deviant behavior was becoming the norm. We're seeing that play out across our society, particularly in terms of how we conduct our civil affairs. It's important that we have debates. It's important that we have philosophical division and contention. But the debate that I have seen taking place is degrading. It is turning into a Tower of Babel. It is turning into a chaotic situation where only those voices who shout the loudest, who make the most outrageous statements, get the attention. And I think we're doing enormous. We are doing enormous damage to ourselves. And I can tell you from all of the countries that I travel to, and I meet with heads of state around the world, they look at the United States and they wonder if we should still be considered to be a serious nation. They look at the quality of the debate. They look at how petty and how irrelevant and how poisonous the atmosphere is. And they wonder, can the United States continue to be the leader throughout the world? When we allow ourselves to really engage in this sort of uncivil behavior, that we have reduced our language to shouting at each other rather than debating each other, then I think that other countries are going to look elsewhere for leadership, and that would be a great misfortune for the rest of the world.
The next question is directed to Attorney General Holder. Will you comment on the amount of time or the progress that's been made on the closing of Guantanamo Bay Prison?
What we've said is that it is going to be difficult to reach the deadline that the President set of January the 22nd. But what we've also said, and I continue to reiterate as the President, is that the facility will be closed. Guantanamo will be closed. It is a place that, because of its history, has served as a recruiting tool for those who would do this nation harm. It has served as a chip, a block, an impediment to our relationship with many of our allies. So our hope is to still close it by January the 22nd. If that does not occur, it will be closed shortly thereafter. It is something that is a core tenet of our new way of dealing with the world, our new way in dealing with the problem of terrorism. It is one of the first acts that the President signed upon taking office, and Guantanamo, as I said, will ultimately be closed.
That is the last question, so Secretary Cohen, Attorney General Holder, thank you very, very much.
I just have a couple of final words I wanted to add. The one issue we have not talked about today is race or racism. And it's something that has certainly been a part of my life, or anti-Semitism, or any hate organized group. Attorney General Holder talked about hate crimes legislation that's just passed. I think what is dangerous in this country is the level of debate, if you can call it that, has based upon racial overtones. And some of it even coming from the great state of Maine, when we saw that little example of a lottery that was held in one small town. And so I would only hope that as this university and what it represents to the rest of the state and to the intellectual community, that we as citizens of the state of Maine and as citizens of this great country, that we don't stand by in silence, that we don't allow the haters to take the stage and to raise their voices without challenge, that every time we see the ugly head of bigotry and racism or anti-Semitism or any kind of hate directed against any group, that we not be silent witnesses to crimes that we know are going to be committed. And so I hope that all of us will dedicate ourselves to that and to the rule of law, which applies to all of us. And that's why I was particularly pleased that Attorney General Holder would take the time to come to the great state of Maine, his first visit. I didn't forewarn him it might be a bit chilly, and he didn't bring an overcoat. But you warmed up the reception so much that he won't need an overcoat to go all the way back to Washington. But he has just been an outstanding leader for our country. And what he represents to the nation and to people all over the world is that we do believe in the rule of law. We do believe that people of character can achieve the highest positions in our society. And that's something that still stands as a beacon to the rest of the world. When they see that we allow people of capability to rise to our highest levels, that's no place, there is no other place where that's possible. Only in America. And this great country allows people like Eric Holder to hold positions of great power. And he does so with a gentle hand and with a commitment to equality and equity and balance and justice. So thank you very much for coming.
Thanks to Ross and to all of those who submitted questions. That kind of interaction really adds to the dialogue at events like this one. The quality of the questions certainly shows that our audience is well informed on current events. Well done. To Secretary Cohen and Attorney General Holder, our sincerest thanks. You have exceeded our high expectations with your thought-provoking and timely comments today. Like the Cohen lectures that have preceded this one, today's event will live in our memories for a long time to come. Our university and our community are better places because of the insightful discourse at this level, and we are most appreciative. We do have small tokens of appreciation to share, keeping in mind the financial legal limit on gifts of this nature. As has already come out this afternoon, we noticed that both of you have in common you were college basketball players. Certainly the legendary Bangor Billy, if not a legend before today, certainly now today. Secretary Cohen played at Bowdoin, and Attorney General Holder played at Columbia. We're proud of our basketball programs here at UMaine as well, including the incredible legacy that belongs to our women's coach, Cindy Blodgett. As I dare say, just about everybody in the audience knows Cindy is a Black Bear legend. The team she played on made 4 consecutive NCAA tournaments. She scored more than 3,000 career points. She was a first-round WNBA player. And she had a successful professional career before becoming a coach. Here are our beloved Black Bears. I'm pleased to present each of you with a basketball autographed by Cindy Blodgett. The next time President Obama has one of his famous pickup games, you'll be well equipped, but no trash talking after today.
I want Cindy with me.
That concludes our program today. Thanks to each of you for joining us, and enjoy a great fall day in the great state of Maine.